She's a native Texan, moved to Tennessee about years ago. I didn't ask her why she made that move, and I'm not going to now. But Texas loss is our game. And she said that she is largely self-taught up until the time that she had the opportunity to take some very intensive training with David LaFell. She went to Taos and studied in his studio there, and then some workshops a little later in Texas. She has also studied at the Laguna Gloria Museum Art School. She has taken courses and studied under such masters as Sherry DeGraw, Robert Johnson, Greg Kreutz. I love Greg Kreutz.
I love Greg Kreutz too. He's a great teacher.
Yeah. Laura Robb, Gene Chambers, Joanna Arnett. She currently enjoys teaching and offers workshops and classes in both oil painting and in pastel. And I can't pass this up without mentioning this. She has her name and her work included in the AKC Museum, the dog's prestigious National Artist Registry. That's pretty cool. And you will see an example of her dog portraiture, canine portraiture, excuse me, over to my left and your right. So let me introduce to you our speaker today, Rebecca Neef.
Thank you, and I hope that I can get through all of this and make some sense. I've painted a lot of different styles in all the years that I've gone back and forth with this, and I've dabbled and thought that I wanted to be an impressionist, and as he said, I've done dog portraiture. I did nothing but dog portraiture and horse portraiture for years, and so I got into some pretty tight realism, and that didn't really leave a lot of room for interpretation and impressionistic stuff. And I think I've kind of gotten a style for myself that works, since my instructors and people that I've learned from over the years are not always going to be there with me. I needed a system, and I call it 7 Keys to Better Painting. I did not come up with these. These are 7 tried and true, proven principles that you use for making realistic representational art. For that matter, if you want to be an abstract artist, if you want to be a good abstract artist and have timeless work that's remembered and revered among people who like that sort of art, you have to adhere to these principles for abstract art as well. It's all about balance. But I don't do a lot of abstract art. I dabbled in that too and didn't like it. As David LaFell says, the problem with abstract art for him is, how do you know when you're getting better? I thought that was true. What I strive for in my work, even in the dog portraits, when I still do them, is a feeling of timelessness. I don't want something trendy. Those words are opposites. There's timelessness and there's trendiness. And trendy means it's popular now, but kind of by its definition, it means it may not be popular later. I want mine to be timeless. I want it to look as good to someone 200 years from now or 500 years from now as it does to me now, or to whoever's looking at it. And so the artists that I emulate or study are artists who, maybe they were popular in their time, maybe not, but they look good to me now, even though most of them are a couple hundred years old or more. I really like artists like Chardin and Rembrandt. Emil Carlson is a big favorite of mine. Since I strive for timelessness, and the way I see the universe is that the only thing timeless is universal law, physics, the thing that makes the universe keep working. Natural law. So I think of my approach to painting as visual physics. I look at things and I try to figure out how is it that light falls on objects and our eyes interpret it and relay it to our brain. Because that is timeless, that doesn't change, you know. I try to teach my students to follow these 7 principles. And even though they're principles, I try to teach them as steps because there is a logical sequence. When you're doing a representational painting, there's a logical sequence that you encounter each of these principles at. And you will come back to them, you know, and touch on them over and over again as you go. And, you know, I'll hop around and, you know, I'll start here and work my way down. Then I may go back up and check my composition or something. But I generally encounter them when I'm building a painting in this order. My approach is to try to simplify everything. Art is complicated enough without making it more complicated. So I try to take all of these principles and see how simple I can make them. I try to break things down into manageable chunks. So for me, this is like a safety net. If I get stuck in a painting, and I do, I get stuck all the time. That's why I have so many unfinished paintings. Sometimes I get stuck, and sometimes I just get bored. Sometimes I say, oh, okay, I see how this works. Well, now I don't care about it anymore, so I'll do something else, and I'll come back to it later. But if you do get stuck in a painting, or if it's gone wrong somehow, and you're not quite sure what's wrong with it, this is a great safety net to have these 7 things once you understand how they, you know, how they apply. And you can just use it as a checklist and go down this list. It's like, okay, was my concept off in the first place? Or is my composition, did I not stick with my composition? You know, check each thing. I think of it as an owner's manual for artists. And of course, each of these subjects is an enormous, vast subject. And we're not gonna, you know, we're not gonna talk about all that there is today. They're way too big for this time frame. But what we need for doing a painting is really pretty simple on most of them. You can make it as complicated as you want. You know, most artists pick one or another and they really make a study of it. They get fascinated with values, or another artist gets fascinated with color or composition. But to get started and to paint these kinds of paintings, you don't need to make it complicated unless you just want to. The first principle is concept. I can figure out how to move on here. And that is, what's the big idea about the painting? Why did you want to paint this? And because it's so pretty, that's not good enough. I mean, I know that's why we start in the beginning sometimes. Or because we think, oh, if I paint this, someone will buy it. You know, I'll paint a local landmark because the tourists will buy it or whatever. That's not a concept. That's a popularity. A concept can be a lot of different things. It can be that you're trying to capture an intangible thing, like a feeling. Like, you know, a misty scene and the feeling of serenity or somberness that you got from a certain scene, something like that. A lot of the time for me, the concept is a puzzle. It's like, I wonder if I did such and such and only allowed myself so and so, could I make this work? For instance, the next to the last painting, down there on the right, the little girl in a small black frame, I only allowed myself to use a really, really limited palette for that. I let myself use, I think I used white, Venetian red, yellow ochre, and ivory red, and that was it. So that little girl's green eyes, there was no blue, there was no bright yellow in this palette. That little girl's green eyes had to come from those colors. And doing things like that, really setting yourself a puzzle, will teach you so much more about your materials and about your limits and about harmony. I find that you learn a lot about color harmony by setting yourself color challenges. I have other paintings where I have, this painting was a color challenge. I only allowed myself to use, it's another limited palette thing. I only allowed myself to use, I think it was ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, and cadmium red maybe. This one was a composition puzzle for me. I had been told by one of my instructors early on that this composition could not work. That it led the eye in the wrong direction and caused you to read from right to left instead of left to right. That brings us to composition. Really, when it comes down to it, it's really just about size and placement. Everything in the beginning of a painting is about size and placement. And that's not bad. A few rules that you really do need to know, and are guidelines, I guess I should say. And one of them is placement, and that is that you don't really want to place your focal area most of the time. It could be another one of those challenges to yourself to see if you could get away with it, but you really don't want to place your focal area or your horizon if you're doing a landscape right in the middle of your canvas. You get what's thought of as a bullseye effect. It's better to put it off to one side or slightly below or slightly above the middle part of your canvas. It's more pleasing to the eye, and there are all kinds of theories why that is, but you've probably all heard of the golden mean, the golden ratio. We've talked about the Fibonacci sequence. Christy sent something out recently where it was called the rule of thirds. It's all pretty much the same thing. Basically, you divide your canvas 3 ways, left to right, divide it 3 ways, top to bottom. Where those lines cross, that's where you can get away with putting your center of interest and have it look good, have it be pleasing to most people's eye. Don't put it right smack in the middle. Later on, when you're really, really good, you can try that, and some people can get away with it. Sometimes it looks good, but most of the time it's best to avoid that area. In fact, Joanna Arnett, one of the people that I studied with, I just took one workshop from her, but she's a really good teacher. She's a very successful painter. And she actually puts a big X right in the middle of her canvas when she gets started to remind herself to avoid that area like a plague. When she's, she always does her focal area first. And that way all she has to do is make sure her focal area doesn't touch that X. And she's, so, even artists that have been doing this for a living for a long time need little systems to remind themselves of what they should and should not do sometimes. Size. The main thing about size for me is that in classical representational painting, it's best to paint at life size or slightly less than life size. You can even paint really small and call it a miniature, but it's best not to paint this type of painting over life size, larger than life. It causes a feeling of conflict in the human brain to see something that they can identify. They know what it is, like say it's an apple. I know that's an apple. I know an apple never gets any bigger than about this. So why is it this big? It causes conflict in the part of your brain that's in charge of that type of thing, in charge of identifying reality. Space is a good thing to know about in terms of size and placement in your composition. You don't want to have a real crowded composition. You need to have some place for the viewer's eye to rest and absorb. You need some quiet places. A real crowded painting is kind of like a real bright painting. You see some pop art paintings or impressionist paintings that are just a riot of color. And none of the color is grayed down. It's all really bright. It looks like it came straight from the tube. And it's just like a party on the canvas. But after a while, a party gets old and you need to go home and relax. And that's what negative space is good for. I mean, it's good for a lot of other things too, but not only negative space in terms of the spaces between the objects, but in other aspects of the painting you could think of colorless or almost colorless spaces as being negative spaces. The spaces where the lines are very blurry, you know, between one object and another. Those are the kind of places that give your eye a little rest and are not constantly calling on your eye to make decisions and identifications in a painting. Continuity is important. You can see what I use a lot of the time in paintings for continuity is the shadow masses, and you know, in some paintings I'll use the lit planes, but either way, you have a feeling that things are flowing from one item to the next, from one object to the next object. And I mean, a continuity might not be the only word for that. A sense of flow is a good way to put that too. It has to do with the direction of the light. You always have to think about the direction of the light in a painting. And you can direct the viewer through the painting using the direction of the light, because it will cause all the shadows to go in the same direction, and it causes a feeling of flow through the paint. They're not only tangent in that they're touching but not overlapping, but they're also sitting on the same level. And that's disturbing to our eye, because we're not really sure what's going on there. It's like, is that just a disc, or is it actually a ball? And if it's a ball, why can't I tell? You know, if we overlap them, now we know it's a ball, even though there's no shading on it. So we don't have values yet to help us identify the form. Just the fact that we overlap them already tells us a little bit more about it, that it is likely to be a sphere, and it must not be a disc. It also gives us a feeling of depth. You know, we're able to go back into the picture plane of the painting a little bit. Another good thing to know about composition is variety. You want to vary your shapes. Don't have a painting that's all of, nothing but circular, like a painting of 3 oranges, an apple, and, you know, and a cantaloupe. They're all circles, they're all balls. That would be a boring painting. Or all cylinders, or, you know, you want to vary your shapes. You want to vary everything in your painting if you can. Vary your brush strokes, so that some areas have lively brush strokes and some areas have very calm, quiet brush strokes with no strokes showing really. Vary your thickness of your paint, vary the hardness and softness of your lines, your edges, I mean. So variety is really important in composition. And these are all things that some of them you will encounter as you go, and you'll say, oh, look, here's a place that could be better because I need to soften this edge and it'll be better. But a lot of this stuff is stuff that you can plan from the very beginning of painting like this. It may be in an S curve or a circle, but you're led around and around in it. And that's what this one is. And another kind of composition is where you're led from one side to the other, left to right, right to left. And the other kind that you typically see is where you're led into the painting. You're led from the foreground back into the background. You're coming into the painting here, and your natural thing to do is to follow the line of the dog's head and the way that he's looking. So you come down this way, your eye comes down this way, it hits these grasses down here. And you notice none of these grasses are sticking up way up here blocking so that the dog's looking like this, and it would stop your eye. So that the eye is going to come down here, it's going to hit this tall grass over here at the edge, and that directs it back up to the other view of the dog, which you follow the line of that dog and you come back to where you started. So it's a circular composition. Just goes round and round and round. Keeps your eye in the picture, and keeps your mind thinking about what the picture is all about. You know, the things that the dog can do, and the environment that he does it in, basically. This one is a left to right composition, or a side to side composition. It's left to right mostly because that's the direction the light is coming from. It's coming from just slightly to the left and in the front. But you can see that the shadows down here under these, under all the fruits, all the shadows come across like this and direct your eye over toward the next object. But also in this one, and in a lot of my still lifes, I use little sparkly pieces of light to do the same thing. So I might have liked to put a little sparkly piece of light right here on this to direct the eye on along this way, but there was no need because I knew I was going to put that sparkly piece of light on the top of that little vase. And if I had put it in both places, it would have been confusing to the eye. It would have been too much. So you have a bright spot here, and then we have a bright spot here, and then another one here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And then you notice that they taper from here, which is the mostly the focal point. They taper off. The next one over here is slightly less bright. And then there aren't as many, and then, you know, it just kind of trickles off and goes away. So that's how we kind of build a crescendo to about right here, and then it trickles off. Lets you know that the composition is over. This one is a front to back composition. This is about leading you back into the painting. And it's a pretty obvious ploy right here with this big white pool of light. But that's what I felt like I needed to do to get you to feel like you were drawn back into it. I did not want this composition to read left or right because I had three very similar objects. They're all round, they're slightly, you know, even the little jug is slightly more round than it is cylindrical. And I didn't want them to feel like they were just lined up in a row. So I wanted you to look at them front to back. Drawing, everybody's scared of drawing. And I was talking to one of you earlier that felt like she couldn't paint until she got better drawing. And we all feel like that. We all feel like our drawing really needs to be better. But the good thing about painting is that you can separate your drawing from your painting. I think it's great to work on your drawing, and I mean, I do it too. But when it comes to painting, I don't worry about it. Drawing for the purpose of painting is really, really simple. There's a saying here that getting a good representational painting together boils down to simply getting the right shape, in the right size, in the right place, in the right color, in the right value, with the right brushwork and the right edges. Oh, no problem, right? But if you think about it, the first three of those factors, those 7 things I just named off, shape, size, and placement, they're all about drawing. So we can't avoid drawing. You know, if we trace things or project things or what are some of the other things that we could do? Grid things out. You know, we'll get the painting done, but we won't be able to construct these fun compositions because we won't really be understanding our painting. And there's just no reason to avoid drawing like the plague because what we need for the purpose of painting is so simple. You see those shapes on that top little unfinished painting there. That's as technical as I ever get in the beginning. It really is. I mean, it's just, I wish I had one that was even more simple than that. But anyway, it's, this is a drawing. And this is a work that's intended to stand on its own. For this, you do have to study. You have to study, you have to practice, you have to understand principles and all kinds of, you know, things that we're not concerned with for the purpose of painting. But as I said, this is not something that you do intending to paint over it. This is a work of art on its own. This is a sketch. A sketch is basically note-taking. It's, I want to capture this and see if I could do such and such with it. I want to see if, you know, like for instance, I want to see if this dog would look good in painting in this position. Or I want to see if something looks good with a certain effect of light on it. So you might sketch it out with the light coming from one direction, sketch it out again with the light coming from another direction. But these are just notes that you're taking for yourself to be used later. They're not intended to stand on their own as a work of art. There's another sketch. That was Da Vinci trying to learn the proportions of a dog's head. And obviously, this was not meant to stand on its own as a work of art. This is all you need to know how to do to start a still life painting. And really, pretty much any kind of painting. I'll show later how you can start a landscape painting the same way. Just big, simple shapes. That is the beginning of this painting right here. That is what this painting looks like in its infancy. And that's how all of my paintings start out. They start out with this horrible, crude mess. And you just tweak it as you go. And you don't beat yourself up because it's not a beautiful drawing, because that's not what you're trying to accomplish here. You know, to begin a painting drawing is really just about simplifying all of the shapes in what you're looking at into the simplest shapes that you can get and getting them arranged right in relation to one another. And, you know, I talked about placement, getting them placed on the canvas. Obviously, you don't want to chop somebody's head off or have it fall off the side of the canvas or something. So, really all you need to be able to do is come up with some fairly identifiable, real simple shapes like squares and circles and triangles. And I mean, you can see here I've got this vase is nothing but a circle with a little rectangle on top of it that will later become a cylinder. And, you know, we've got a wedge shape here. We've got an oval here that becomes the ellipse of the top of the watermelon later. Really, really simple shapes that we don't worry too much about. And at this point in that particular painting, I had started to think in terms of value also, and even temperature. I knew that I wanted that shelf front to be warmer in temperature than the background so that it would advance toward us. So I had gone ahead and put some color on that just to remind myself that that's what I wanted. But mostly at this point, all I was thinking about was shapes. And that brings us to value. Value is really important for recognition. And what I mean by recognition is the way that we recognize what we're looking at. When we look at a sphere, we'll use that again because it's simple. We know it's a sphere because of the values on it. We know value just simply means the lightness or darkness of something. Light brown versus dark brown, you know, gray versus black. So there's a value scale. It's got 7 values on it. We could go 9 values by putting white at one end down at number 1. And at the other end, we could, well, actually it's got 6 values, but anyway, up at number 8, we could go to black and, you know, add a couple more, but that's one example of a value scale. This shows how value gives away form. It allows us to recognize form. There are any number of values that you could see, and you can divide it up into almost a limitless amount. But for our purposes, if we have 5 values on something, everybody's going to be able to know what it is if we have the right values in the right places. And so you almost always are going to have a form shadow. That's the shadow on the form itself. In this case, it's a ball. That could translate to so many other things. You know, that ball could be that turnip or the vase. It could be the turn of someone's cheek if you're painting portraits. And you break it down from there. But you're always going to have a form shadow. That's the shadow on the form itself. Then you're going to have a cast shadow. Which is, you know, the shadow that that object casts on whatever it's sitting on or whatever's next to it. And you have the lid planes where the light is falling directly on it. And then you have the midtones that are usually between that lit plane and the shadow. It's not bright enough to be considered lit, and it's not dark enough to be considered shadow. It's kind of in a no man's land. And then on a lot of objects, especially if they're hard or slick surfaced, shiny surfaced, you'll have a highlight. You don't have a highlight on everything. If something is soft and fuzzy, it's not going to have a highlight. So something like, you know, if you're painting a peach or a baby's cheek or a bunny rabbit, they're soft and fuzzy and they're not going to have a highlight. And that comes down to just looking. You know, just look and see. A lot of times people will automatically paint a highlight on both eyes of a person if they're painting a portrait. And if you look, sometimes both eyes don't have a highlight because the eyelid may be blocking the light or the way the face is turned. So a lot of that just comes down to paying attention. And then, so that we're not always talking about balls and spheres, there's some other organic shapes that almost everything can be broken down to one or the other of those shapes. When you start painting, if you squint at your subject, that will help you to see the values. And sometimes it's kind of hard to see the values, and you know, you're blinded by color and you're blinded by detail. But if you squint until all you can see is just barely through your eyelashes, you can break things down. You do away with that detail. And you can see, oh, well, the shadow comes along here, drops down to the cheekbone, and goes along under the chin line, or whatever. And you might not be able to see it otherwise. It just helps you concentrate on value and nothing else. But when you start a painting, if you squint and you can reduce the composition down to just two values, you'll help the strength of your composition a lot. Just basically figure out, is the light falling on it or is the light not falling on it? And so paint everything, when you start out, paint everything dark that the light is not falling on, and leave it light if the light is falling on it. And then from there, you can expand your value range and say, okay, now this part in the light is a little bit darker than this other part, and start expanding that way. A lot of the time, when people have a painting where they think that they've got a muddy look, and they say, oh, I've made mud. A lot of the time what causes that is that you've got the wrong value in the wrong place. You've got most of the time it's because you have your shadows too light, or because you've painted them with opaque pigments. Opaque pigments in the shadows it's not a hard and fast rule, but they can cause a feeling of mud because they reflect light back at the viewer. And to our brain, light being reflected back at us, it tells us this is not a shadow, because there shouldn't be any light in there if it's a shadow. That's different sometimes in that you may have some reflected light in a shadow, or especially if you're outside on a bright day, the sky will reflect light down into some of the shadows. But for the most part, you can get a muddy look from having the wrong value in the wrong place, and it's usually because you went too light in your shadows, or else you've used opaque pigments in them. Now these clowns illustrate to you what I'm talking about how value equals recognition. We don't have outlines around these guys' faces. We don't have any color, so we don't know what color their hair is or their eyes or anything. But if these were people we knew, we would be able to say, well, this is Sam, and this is Joe, and this is Bob, and this is Susan, and so forth, just from this, and all we have to work with here is values. So that's how value is so important, so crucial to recognizing form. Not just recognizing people, but recognizing form. You know what it is you're looking at because of value. And here's another example. We know we're looking at trees. We can tell that this is water. We know it's not a road. We know it's not snow. We can tell that it's water. We can even tell that there's mist back here. And all we have to go on is value. Same thing here. This is a Good example of a really wide value range. We've got absolute black right here under this bridge, and another spot back here, along here under this bank. And then we've got nearly absolute white in the snow in several places. And yet, so again, all we have is value, and yet we know exactly what we're looking at. There's really no other part of, no other facet of art, of painting, that can communicate as much to us as value. Color can't, drawing can't. And for one thing, color and drawing both rely on value to some degree, so value is critical. Again, here, we know what we're looking at, and even though we have no color, no texture, no nothing, just value, not even really in line in this particular one, we still get the sensation of blinding light coming out of this hole in the clouds, just from black and white and all the values in between. So, that probably is enough of my rant on value, but I'm really, really keen on people understanding how important it is. And a lot of the time when my paintings have a problem, if I'll get up and get away from it for a while and come back and take a look at it, it'll jump out at me. Oh my goodness, the values are totally off. You know, I've got this shadow lighter than this spot over here that's in the light, or this light plane is actually darker than one of the shadow planes near it. And if you get your values right, it's 3/4 of the battle. Color, to me, is the key to mood. It is, if value is the key to recognition, color is visual joy, or the lack of it. If you want a somber mood, color's the key there too. It goes back to what I was talking about earlier, when I was talking about the bright painting or a loud party, same kind of thing. Color can be too much. You know, you can have a really bright painting with no grayed down areas, and you can love it at first. You know, when you look at a painting like that, you say, wow, that's a fantastic painting. It just makes me smile to see it. But then the third or fourth time or the 10th time you see it, it's like, oh man, somebody hang something over that so I don't have to look at it again. It's putting my eye out. You know, you want to look at something quiet every now and then. So for me, and for this type of painting, a better strategy with color is to pick your focal area, concentrate all your joyful color in that area, and let it kind of trickle off everywhere else. And of course, there's our friend, the color wheel, which we've probably all seen since we were little kids in school. The color wheel is tired and overexposed maybe as it is a really good tool, and I still use it. Like I said, I use it a lot of the time in my compositions, like that asparagus composition was all about those two colors positioned across from each other on the color wheel. Every color has its own value. As it comes straight out of the tube, it has a value already. And these are value scales painted with 3 different colors, and you notice that where they came out of the tube falls on different places in the value scale. Like this is cad red. You can barely see it. This is cad red. It's like, I think, 3rd over from the really dark side. And that's where it came out of the tube. So it's, slightly on the dark side of the value scale. And here's ultramarine blue. It's really dark. It's getting pretty close to black as it comes out of the tube. On the other hand, it's cadmium yellow light, and it's right down toward the white end of the value scale. So you think, well, okay, I can change it. I can make it lighter or darker, and you can. And you can make them lighter or darker in a lot of different ways. You don't necessarily want to just add black or white to it. But what you need to understand about that is that when you start changing the value of a color, you change other things about it. You're not necessarily going to change too much about the hue. It's still, yellow is still gonna be in the yellow family for the most part. But you're going to change its intensity. So you see, as I change this yellow and add white to make it lighter, it gets less yellow. It's much less of an intense yellow over here than it is here. And as I add something to darken it, I don't remember what I used to darken it, it gets less intense, it gets dull. And that's what intensity means, brightness or dullness. And on this end, I talk about intensity, and I illustrated intensity by mixing colors with their complements. And for anyone who's not familiar with complementary colors, it just means it's opposite from it on the color wheel. So we have a bright green over here, opposite that on the color wheel would be red. And you see the very first tiny speck of red I added to that green got duller. And a little more red and it got more dull. Same thing with the red. Add just a little bit of green and it got dull. And the more you add, the duller it goes. Here we have an orange and a blue. I did 2 orange and blue stripes to show you what happens when you start with colors of different values in the first place. For instance, this is orange and this is orange. This is a duller orange, meaning it's lower in intensity, but it's also a darker orange in value. And this, by the way, is transparent oxide red, which is just a transparent version of burnt sienna. So it's much darker in value than this one. Here we have cerulean blue, which I chose because it's about the same value as this orange straight out of the tube. And you see the colors that you get when you start mixing it, they both get duller. This is ultramarine blue, which I chose because it's the same value as this. Also, both of these are transparent. Both of these are opaque. And down here we have what happens when you mix bright yellow with violet. You get duller violets, you get duller yellows, and somewhere in the middle of any of these, you'll be able to get just a neutral gray. And you can pass this around if you want to be able to look at it a little more closely. For me, the best way, the most effective way for me to learn about color and learn what it will do, I know Richard Schmidt is fond of having people paint color charts. And I did those, but they're really tedious. And they take up a lot of space and a lot of your time. And I find I learn more about color and what my paints, what my tools on my palette will do is by doing color wheels. And I will take different pigments to be my primaries. For instance, this has a coolish red. This was anthracnone red. And a warmish blue. Or no, actually that's a true blue. It's cobalt, which just means it doesn't lean toward red or toward yellow. It's just blue. And cadmium yellow. And this is what I got. So because this is a fairly coolish blue, that means that when I mixed it with yellow, I didn't get really bright oranges. It takes away from the brightness of the orange because the red is not a hot, fiery red. Whereas over here, I used a hot, fiery red and I got hot, fiery oranges. But because I used a hot, fiery red, I got dull violets when I mixed it with blue. And so you learn about your color that way by trying out different primaries and mixing together to see what they make. This is what some people call a medieval palette. I've heard people call it a Renaissance palette, but they actually had a pretty good number of pigments in the Renaissance. That's just ivory black and it's either Venetian red or Indian red. I think I wrote Venetian red on it, and yellow ochre. So I don't have any bright colors. The ivory black is standing in as my blue. In my color theory, I make myself think of black, and I only use ivory black for this reason. I make myself think of black as a dark, dull blue, because when I mix it with things, that's how it behaves. It darkens things, obviously, but it also cools them, which is why I rarely use it in shadows. because it cools things, and I don't like my shadows to be cool. My light is warm, my light is cool, so I want my shadows to be warm. But anyway, you can see from this, if I pass this around, you can see the different versions of primary and secondary colors that you can make with just 3 pigments. And this is pretty much the same thing. All the colors on this board were made with 3 tubes of paint. I started with a primary red, which for this board it was Caroline red, and cadmium yellow, light, and ultramarine blue deep. And everything else on here was mixed from that. Now these spokes coming out are where I added a little bit of white to it. Down here is where I took all of those 12 primary, or 12 color wheel colors and added a little black to it, just to see how dull the black would make it. So you can pass that around and see what you can do with only 3 tubes of paint plus a little bit of white to tint it with. There's so much that you can do with color with so little. I mean, we all love to play in color, and I will tell you that you can do so much with 3 tubes of paint plus white, and then I own hundreds of tubes of color, and every time somebody comes out with a new one, I'm the first in line to play with it. But it's, I always come back to the tried and true. To me, the only reason, or almost the only reason that a color has any business on my palette is I want it to address one of the 12 spots on the color wheel. I want it to enable me to paint red, yellow, blue, violet, orange, green, or any of the spots in between those. If it doesn't do that, why do I need it? I have a few. This is my daily palette. This is what I put out every day. The ones with the little square drawn around them, those are the ones that are not there every day. Those are the ones that I use occasionally. And that's because this is what I need to address all of those 12 spots on the color wheel. If you can hit all of those 12 spots, what more do you need? So I have white, I have cadmium yellow. This one up here is cadmium yellow light. Once in a blue moon, I'll put cad yellow lemon. If I know I'm going to need to mix like a bright lime green, I might put cad yellow lemon out. I have cad yellow deep. That's strictly there for my convenience because I can mix it by using those two, but I use it frequently. So it's easier just to go ahead and have it out. I have cadmium red light most of the time. Rarely do I use any other cadmium red because I can make it by mixing a little of this alizarin with that. I have transparent oxide red, which is just a transparent version of burnt sienna. I don't like burnt sienna or burnt umber because they're opaque, and I have enough challenges before me without having pigments that are already muddy at the beginning. They're muddy because they are made from dirt. They're ground up clay. So I kind of shoot myself in the foot from the beginning here, so I try to give myself a break when I can. I have yellow ochre out almost all the time. It may sit there a long time because I rarely use it, but when I want it, I want it. This is a weird one. This is not a classic traditional one. This is Grumbacher sap green. I don't use any other brand of sap green because this one is the right temperature for me, and it's completely transparent. There's no opacity to it. So again, I don't have to worry about ending up with mud. And most artists will use Viridian for that spot because it's more of a true green. But Viridian is too cold for me. I know from my personal experience, I have a tendency to let my paintings look too cold. So I limit my ability to do that by not having a cold green on there. Ultramarine blue, I usually use ultramarine blue deep by Rembrandt. If I couldn't get that, I would buy somebody's color called French ultramarine. It's the same thing. French ultramarine just means it's darker and it has a little bit more red leaning to it. And then that's ivory black. This one comes out once in a blue moon. when I know I'm gonna want some kind of turquoisey color. That's manganese blue hue, meaning it's not true manganese, which you really can't get anymore. And it's made by M. Graham. This one up here is raw umber, which I also use once in a blue moon, mostly when I'm painting flesh tones. Look at what I tell my students is the first spot of color you put on your painting, try to find the most obvious color in your composition. Like say, on that, which one's a good one to show you? Well, like this. The red of that apple is pretty obvious. It's not a subtle color. You can pretty much put cadmium red straight from the tube, right about there, and hit it dead on. But then next to it, where that highlight is, you can look at that spot on your apple and say, okay, how is that different? I can see that it's different, but how is it different? Is it darker or lighter? Well, it might be a tiny bit darker, but not much so. I want to darken it. Well, is it brighter or duller? Well, it's duller. So I know from already that I want to darken it and dull it. So I'm thinking already, well, if I mix it with something darker, like maybe that sap green is darker, that will also dull it because it's the opposite of red. By the same token, I could mix it with transparent oxide red. That would do the same thing. So you have options. Next spot over, it's lighter by a little bit. It's a little duller, but the main thing is it's in a completely different color family. So we need to jump to a different hue. It's in the yellow color family, but it's not bright yellow. It's a dull yellow. So that's what you do. You get the most obvious spot and put that down first. And then every spot next to it, just think about those things. Is it brighter or duller, darker or lighter? Is it in a different color family entirely? I myself think about temperature a lot. Is it warmer or cooler? That is not technically one of the aspects of color because temperature is considered part of hue. You know, like one hue is, for instance, blue is going to be cooler than yellow or orange. But it helps me to think about temperature a lot. So once you've got that most obvious color nailed down, everything else after that is just a comparing process. Anyway, we could talk about color a lot, but one of the things that I like to do, like I said, is try limited palettes and see what the colors do when you mix them with each other. Try dulling colors with different things. You can try mixing the color with black. You can try mixing with transparent oxide red with raw umber. You could try mixing it with its complement. All different kinds of things to see what will happen. But I find that people will learn more about color, at least for myself, but it seems like pretty much everybody, if you just play with it. If you just have a day in your studio when you just play with color and see what happens when I do this and see what happens when I do this. The pressure's off. You're not making a painting, you're just playing. And that will work better and you'll remember it better than trying to memorize color recipes and color rules. That always takes all the fun out of everything anyway. So, you know, you have fun, what's the point? Work, paint application, it's the same thing. Paint manipulation is another way to say it. This is what makes, we can do things with oil that we can't do with, say, watercolor or pastel. And I use both of those mediums, but I love them. But I keep going back to oil because what you can do with oil is almost limitless. And you can't say that about the other two. They have definite limits. You can paint transparent shadows with oil, and it's almost impossible to do that with pastel. You know, we try to come up with techniques to use pastel that emulates what you can do with oil, but with oil it's effortless. So you see in here, for starters, I've used transparent pigments in the shadows. I'm talking about the background shadow areas right now. Down here, I have painted the shadows with some opaque pigments, which is kind of a no-no. But because it's oil, I have scraped it back to where some of the white paint is showing under, or the white canvas is showing underneath. You can't really do that with the other two mediums that I mentioned. You can do so much with brushwork and oil that you can't do with the other mediums. I mean, you see right here the highlight. I don't know if you can tell or not, and this highlight down here, those are really thick. I mean, those highlights are, you can feel them with your finger, you know, they're sticking way out. And it makes them reflect light because there's an actual physical ridge of paint sticking out there that reflects light. You can have little zingy areas like this where your brush slipped across the canvas and made a fuzzy area that attracts the eye. You see here where you have a soft edge. Those are all examples of both brushwork and edges. Here's the same kind of subject, handled in a little bit different way. You see, I've painted this pear in a much more quiet, calm way, and that's really all just about brushwork and paint manipulation. It's the same colors, you know, as the last picture, but I've just handled the pear much more calmly and quietly, and I've used all the thick brushwork on the fabric. I've let a lot more of the brushwork show in the background here. Because this painting is so simple, I didn't think it would hurt anything to have a little action going on back here. This one, again, you can see right here, I was able to use some pretty sharp edges and some bright contrast between the blue and the white on this little base. Obviously, I'm not showing you the whole picture, but just this little area of it illustrates what I'm talking about with edges in particular. I used some really sharp, crisp edges on this pattern because I wanted this to be one of the focal areas. In this particular painting, if you remember, it was the one with the flower that arched over, so it was a circular composition, but I wanted something that would draw you back into this, and so I had very crisp edges and high contrast here. Whereas this edge, you see, if I had left this edge hard and sharp and bright, it would have messed up the composition quite a bit because you would have been drawn over to the edge of the canvas instead of going in that continuous circle. It also would have made this face look very cut out and pasted on and not round. So over here we have a very soft edge that's almost a lost edge. By contrast, we have this shelf thing that's jutting forward to us, and for that I have very hard, crisp edges and, you know, a fair amount of contrast to make you understand that that's a hard subject, a hard material. Same thing here. We have a very bright contrast area here because the light's falling directly on it. So I have a fairly sharp edge. I have a sharp edge here where this light is falling on the edge of the bowl. You might think that because the light is coming in this way, that I should have a sharp edge here, but that leaf is kind of curling back away from us. It's curling back into the shadow that's being cast on it by this bowl and this little nectarine thingy. And so I wanted the feeling of that leaf curling back away from us into the shadow. So I left that edge very soft. It's almost lost. And the light, I'm going to keep doing it. The light actually kind of skirted across here and hit this leaf right on the edge. And it just produced a real zingy effect in my mind. So I gave that a much sharper, crisper edge, even though it's on the side away from the light, because it was curling back toward the light. And if I hadn't done that, you wouldn't realize the form of that leaf. That leaf would just look flat. You wouldn't know that it was cut like that. So all of that is brushwork and edges. They're kind of the magic at the end of the painting that really gives it its mood. And that, my friends, is the end of my rant. You know, with edges, I will rant one little bit more, because edges are like composition. There are some basic guidelines that are really important, and I'm kind of an edge nut. That's about the last thing that I go back to in my painting, because I go back to my paintings day after day after day for a couple of weeks, usually after I think they're finished. Is it really finished? Is it really finished? Is it really finished? And I check edges a lot because, like I said, to me, edges are what put the magic on everything. One thing is that you use, like I said, you use crisp or sharp, hard edges where the light is shining on something, where the light is falling directly on it, or where a light object is overlapping a dark background or a dark object. So, contrast. And you use soft or even sometimes gloss edges where something is rolling back into shadow or rolling back into a distance. It gives you a feeling that it's going away. And you just have to use your own judgment to decide whether you want that edge to be soft or lost entirely. Too many lost edges and too many soft edges can make the painting just look mushy, so you can't just use them everywhere. You want to use crisp edges near your focal area. Don't use them out in the periphery of the painting, because it takes the eye away from where you want to be. Maybe we put you in that position, so you use softer edges out toward the edges. As I said before, you use crisp edges and bright highlights for hard, shiny things. So like if you're painting orange or a car, something that's hard and shiny and glossy, that gets crisp edges. I really believe that you shoot yourself in the foot painting from photos, because there's just not enough information here. And I think you can paint from photos really convincingly if you've painted from life for a long time first. So that you know what's there, even if the photo is not giving you that information, you know from experience what ought to be there. So this is, you notice that I have my easel pretty close to the setup. I'm not across the room from it, like 2 or 3 feet from it. Notice I've guided my canvas at the same level. So I'm not looking down at the setup and then looking up at my canvas or some such thing. Another way that we can shoot ourselves in the foot. Try to make it easy on myself as we can, so I don't have to worry about that. I'm looking straight at my canvas, I'm looking straight at my setup. And I have all kinds of boxes and blocks and doodads that also stack until I get it at the right level. And I've got it lit. That black thing behind it, there's a window back there. So I've got a black sheet over the window to block the light out, so I can totally control my light. That's really important for this style of painting. This painting, this is a picture that I told someone about earlier, that a friend of mine took this picture and she emailed it to me. And she said, "Do you notice that in this photograph, the jug looks more real in the painting of the picture than the picture itself does?" And that made me feel good, and it made me realize it kind of gelled in my mind what it is that I'm aiming for. I want it to look better than a photograph. Because if it's only going to look as good as the picture, why paint? It's cheaper to just buy the picture, you know, or take a photo. So it needs to look better. And that, to me, is the kind of editorializing that we can do that can't be right. First thing I want to do is kill the white of that canvas. I can't stand looking at that white. You can't judge values on a white canvas. No matter what color you put on it, it's darker than white, so you don't really know what you're looking at until you get rid of that white. You have the same problem painting on black. You can't judge the value of your dark color because everything's lighter than black. So I threw some paint on there and then I smeared it around with a rag or a paper towel and just got rid of the white. What I'm doing here, this is the beginning of my so-called drawing, which I don't do much of, as I said. I blocked in what's going to be a lemon. All I'm concerned with here is its general placement and its size on the canvas. I've given myself an indication of where the back of the table is going to be in the front of the table. I put myself an X right there to remember that that is the middle of my canvas. And I made these two little marks here to tell myself that that is where I think probably the top of my little jug will be. At this point, everything's subject to change. I can change my mind at any point if it doesn't look right. So now I've drawn in my jug, and that's, you know, as technical as I'm likely to get with the drawing. So this is a jug. This is a big head of hydrangea flower, you know, the big ball of hydrangea. This is where the main foliage masses are. So you see, just really simple. Just really don't care what they are right now. All we care about is how much space do they take up on the canvas and where do they overlap each other and that kind of thing. I am at this point already starting to think about value and how it affects the flow of the painting. And I know that I'm going to have a shadow that comes across here and ties in this with this. And this shadow, how far am I going to let it go? Do I want it to go all the way off the canvas, or is that dangerous? So I'm thinking right now I'm just going to leave it right here and don't let it go any further. Got some dark values back here intended to help draw the eye back around. And here I've knocked all the edges off of those hard lines that I just put on, because we don't see the world in terms of outlines. Things don't have an outline around them any place except coloring books. So I take a rag or a paper towel, or sometimes when I'm bad, my finger, and just knock the edge off of everything, soften everything up. Basically, I approach it as if it was a pastel. Okay, and just get in there with the corner of a paper towel and just mess it all up. Helen Van Wyck, I think it was, that said you have to, in order to make something, you have to break it and make it again. And that's what I do. I've got all those nice, hard, sharp, defined lines down and knock them off, get rid of them. But I did put in values. If you notice, I've got shadows in at that point, so I'm ready to start thinking about color a little bit, and temperature, more than color, but mostly just temperature. So no, this is going to be the coldest two areas here. White, blue, and black. Those are the three coldest things on your palette. So, and they're also the biggest masses. They're also really obvious. You know, I said that you can get your color right by picking a really obvious, easy color to match. Well, you know, white, so you can get some white on there. And obviously, I'm not going to put pure white on there, because if I do, how can I paint a highlight on it? So you always sneak up on the color in your lit planes, because you want to be able to have the option to go lighter later on. Make up more than one zine. So I just got the basic local color. Local color just means the average color. So when somebody says paint your orange the local color, well, that's orange. It may be brown in the shadows, and it may be, you know, peach colored in the lip plane, but its local color is just orange. So you start with the most obvious color. So I've got these two big things blocked in here because they're obvious and easy, and it makes you feel good because now there's something on my canvas besides brown. And more of the same, you know, those foliage masses were big and obvious and easy to match. And here I have worked a little bit more on modeling, trying to get this to look round, just using values. Pushing my white a little whiter in the lit area here, a little darker and warmer in the shadowed areas. And attacking that lemon again with the most obvious part of it. Real easy to match that, so that's the part I do. The shadow color is not so easy, so I did this first. The shadow color is kind of vague and weird, so I'm going to do this part first and then figure out from that, okay, is that shadow color cooler or warmer? Is it greener or is it oranger? You know, we know it's going to be duller, and we know it's going to be darker. So, and there I have kind of linked those two planes up together. The shadow plane is linked up with the lit plane with the midtones. And a lot of the time, I don't even mix a midtone. I'll just run the two together. I'll just take some of my shadow color and some of my lit plane color and work them toward each other, and then overlap the brush strokes, and that's it. I have put highlight or two on here. The reason there's 2 highlights on that lemon is because there's 2 forms. We have a sphere form here, and then we have another little bitty sphere form right there. The little nubbin on the end of the lemon, and they're both catching the light at their top part. And you see here that I've also started to put highlights on the picture in places where it meets the light. Put some shadow on under that leaf to start to give it the feeling of depth and form. Put some shadow under where this cloth rolls over the edge of the table so we know that there's a table there. And here we go for pattern. You know, we've painted the form. It looks convincingly three-dimensional. So now we put on the blue stripe and the blue stripe on the cloth, which again was that's a design issue. I could have used any kind of cloth, but I thought it would be neat to have a blue stripe on the cloth to harmonize with this and with this. Harmony plays a big part in my planning process of my paintings. If it's not there in the objects that I choose, I put it in. You're not a slave to what's there. If it's not quite good enough, make it up. Because later on when your painting's done, nobody's going to come up to your painting and say, hey, that cloth did not have a blue stripe, because they weren't there, they didn't see it. They're just going to say, wow, this painting is really harmonious. So here, I started to put in lighter color. And I mean, these are just brush strokes going in different directions in a lighter value blue to indicate petals, where before all we had was just this blue blotch. So no drawing, just splotch, 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 here and there, going in the right directions, facing the light, because that's what makes this petal show its petals, is because the light's falling on from this direction. That's why there's not any showing down here. That's all in shadow, so we can't see if there are petals down there or not. And more of that, push the value on the petals just a little bit lighter. And here I'm deciding that the background was not light enough, was not dark enough. The jug was not popping out from the background enough. So at this point I'm starting to think, okay, that background's not going to cut it. It's not helping me. So let's try getting it darker. So I get it darker. Now that looks better. It's really popping. But it's boring. It's dull. And it's too warm. It doesn't feel right to me. It feels like I said it. So I thought, well, okay. It's too dull, it's too warm, it's too dark. So I put some gray on it. It's like, okay, well that looks horrible, but I like the value better. But it's still too cold. So I'll blend it in a little bit, and that warms it because it's blending with that warm paint that was behind it. I'm liking that better, but now it's too warm. Every step is a matter of comparison. Is it too warm? Is it too cold? Is it too red, too green, too dark, too bright, too dull, too big, too little, too smooth, too not smooth? So here it's like, okay, I like the softness of it, but it's too warm. It's dominating the composition. So I glazed over it with yellow when it got dry and made it a greenish gray. And I felt like that was in harmony with the rest of the painting. Again, we end up kind of by a long circuitous route with me painting a background that is a blend of the main colors. This color, and this color mixed together end up making the color of the background. Here's that watermelon painting. I started this painting from a photograph. You can see in this, the background is pretty much the same color and the same value as that jug. And you can't make the jug out. You can't figure out where it ends and where it begins. That might be a nice thing in some paintings, but I found it very flat and dead and boring. Partly because it's black, so there's no change in temperature. Everything's just flat right there. So I didn't care for that. Thought it needed some help. So here's my beginning drawing. You can see I've got my photo tacked up on the side of my easel over here. I've got one photo where printed it out a little bit lighter so I could see back into the shadows a little bit. Because the photos, I said it really didn't let you see the shape of that face in the back. And I have, just like I did with the tree just now, I pretty much covered the whole canvas with brown and then took my paper towel and just wiped out where I wanted my big shapes to be. And that is the extent of my drawing. So then I went ahead and painted the jug, and I put in my old trusty brownish background because I knew I could get it dark in value, but I could make it contrast a little bit with that jug by making the temperature different. So the jug is black, so it's a very cool temperature. So I went with this, dark rusty reddish color. That would be about the equivalent of burn umber, if I had burn umber on my palette. Because it's slightly different in temperature, so it gives me some interest between the jug and the background. And now you can actually see the form of the jug. It's not lost in that black background. And here I've added some color. Again, those places on the watermelon wedge where the little seeds are, at this point they're not painted on, they're just wiped off. Just dip that pinky wrapped in a paper towel and just wipe on. And this is how I'm taking the grapes a little further here by actually starting to think, instead of just a big blobby space here where I don't want my grapes to be, I'm starting to make individual grapes by wiping their place off. Basically making a little clean bed to paint them into. I painted in the back here of the watermelon, which also did not show in the photo, so I just had to wing it. This is why it's better to paint from life than from a photo when you can, because so much in photos is just not there. And there's the finished painting, and I still felt at this point, or just prior to this point before it got finished, I felt like the background still looked a little flat and it needed more zing. So I painted this little halo around the edge of the watermelon because that's what the light would have been hitting most directly. And I wanted the light to just radiate off of it and give a feeling of glow. And glow is, that's what I call my painting process, is chasing glow. That's what my paintings are all about, is trying to find a way to make it glow. So that's the end of that one. This is a really simple composition, and it's one of my favorites. I loved doing this painting. And you can see I started off bad. I started off with a shriveled up peach. It was several days into the planning process, and the peach that inspired it all was dying a tortured death. Here was my idea. Here's how a composition can be born. Just a value sketch. Like, how would it look if I put this over this, in this perspective? And I wrote myself a note, coolest and lightest. It's going to be right here. And then we're going to put warm here, cool here. I'm thinking already about contrast and bouncing contrasting elements off of each other for the effect that you get. So, in order not to invest myself too much, I did a little, maybe 3-minute pastel scribble. I have this little piece of cardboard that I've covered in acrylic with grit. I think it's a piece of mat board. And it's just for that, because it's covered in acrylic, I can wash it off when I'm done. So it's like my Etch-a-Sketch. And I did little sketches like this, and when I'm done with them, I put it in the tub and scrub it off with a toothbrush, and it's all clean for next time. So this was my idea, and I decided at this point that I think it was a hazelnut that I had on there at first, was dull and boring, and it needed some color, so out comes my trusty grape. Grapes are great for little directing details like that. So I'm starting to do the thing in oil, and at this point, you're probably familiar with how I got to this position. I started out with the placement and the size and did the values, and at this point is where I'm attacking those most obvious colors. I've already given myself the little treat of painting the grape. That's something I learned from David LaFell. So here I'm thinking about values and temperature. I've blocked in the value, the shadow plane, which tells me, you know, my forms. It causes us to recognize that we're looking at a rounded thing. And put some color on. And you can see that I'm still, even with the color, I'm still paying attention to value. I mean, I'm obviously using the darker color back here to show it that it's in shadow. And there's the eboche. I have rubbed all the edges off and made it soft again. So I've gone from this hard-edged thing to this much more soft looking thing. You're going to make it and break it and make it again. So here we've made it again. So I went ahead and gave myself the candy, as David said, and finished out the picture for the most part so that I could see that zing. I get this big kick out of putting those highlights and the little lights across the top where the light just really stings. At this point, I realize I've got a problem. This peach is dark, right where it overlaps this dark picture, and that is just not working. We're losing the peach. We don't know if the peach is round anymore. It's starting to look flat. It's the wrong peach. It's a case of bad casting. So we bring in the stand-in peach, also very shriveled up by this point. But you notice that this peach is a better candidate because I still wanted this little thing where the stem starts to be pointing that way for design purposes. I want it to lead into the picture. But I needed one where this part here could be light and bright and not so dull so it would pop out from that this form that it overlaps. So in goes the new peach. And the old one gets fired. So here's a close-up showing where I've rubbed all the pastel off in oil. Would have just scraped it off or wiped it off with rag. You don't have to, but that way you get a new start. And in pastel, it's more of an issue because you only have so many layers of pastel that will stick to that board or paper, and it's just easier if you start clean. So here's the new peach, and it's much nicer. It pops out. I'm able to give it a light. I can't really give it a highlight because it's a peach. It's not shiny, but I can give it a light because it's a light color on the side, and it just seems like it's a much better fit. And there is the finished, more or less, almost finished. Also, that peach made it, because it had that light bit, it made it possible for me to have some reflected light bounce up here, which also gives a painting a lot of life, and it gives it that glow that I'm chasing. Reflected light is really great for building glow. Again, not only does it reflect here, but it also reflects off of here because that rolls out this way. So the peach color was reflecting off of that. And there's the finished product. I think I had this one. Christy, didn't I have this one hanging in Monthaven last year's exhibit? I think I did. This was another pastel, but I think, yeah, I brought this one. It's the next to the last one down there. Just to show my pastels start and progress just exactly the same way that my oils do. There's my concept. Again, it's a concept based on color. It is a left to right reading composition, but it's also a circular composition. It's an oval instead of a circle, I guess is what I should say. Although the painting obviously goes side to side, the placement of the grapes allows it to be a circular. That's why there's so many grapes in still life setups, by the way. They're great punctuation. They're good when you need a little period somewhere. But they're very good for directing the eye in a curve because you can drape them over things, hang them off the front of the table or whatever. So they're most of the time, it's not because we love painting grapes so much, it's because they're a great device for directing the composition. There's the setup. Again, I tried to get my easel at pretty much the same level as the composition, so I don't have to change perspectives as I go. There's the extent of my drawing, very crude, not worried about much of anything here except just the placement of, really I'm only having to place 3 shapes, the grape shape, the bowl shape, and the eggplant shape, and figure out where my horizon line, where the back surface of the table stops. And here I'm starting to think about values, so I've blocked in really loosely. I think I just used charcoal for that. Blocked in the main shadow shapes. Did I move it? So here I'm starting to paint the shadow shapes with colors in pastel. And as I said, this is also a color concept because the green in the on the stem of the eggplant was almost the same green as the one on the celadon bowl, and the eggplant color was almost the same as the grape color. So they just looked to me like they would all be happy in the composition together. So I've got my shadow colors, kind of a rough approximation. So I'm starting to put in light colors. And I used intentionally the same color that I used at the pale end of the eggplant, I used here to show the light reflecting, bouncing off this table up into the bottom of that bowl. It was pretty accurate that those 2 colors were the same, but I made them more the same, just for the harmony of the painting. I've also, see, I've darkened the value of the background in some places and lightened it in other places to make the center composition pop out better. And then I pushed that even further. I changed the background a little bit more for the same reason, to help the composition, the objects pop out. Where I wanted them to pop out and fade into the background. Like over here, you see we get some really soft edges here where I wanted to just fade away because we're at the end of the painting. It's like a story reading this way, and I want it to taper off. I don't want it to be one of those movies where it's just over all of a sudden and you go, what? That's all? It's over? You need it to kind of taper off slowly so the painting feels like it should be over there, not like somebody took a saw and cut it off here. I think Carl maybe asked me something about if I knew what to do every time, and I told him, no, I never know what to do. Every painting is a struggle. Every painting I start out saying, how in the world am I going to do this? And I may know what I want to do, but I will change it substantially as I go along. My paintings almost never end up looking like what I envisioned at the beginning because I change my mind as I go along, because I'm not at all concerned with staying true to something. All I care about is what's best for the painting. It's like kind of like raising a child. You know, you would prefer that he did this, but you need to do what's best for him. So they're your children, and you got to kind of make decisions on the fly as far as what's best for them at the moment. So one's for different effects. When I was painting with David, I used Marige video because that's what he uses and that's what he wants his students to use when they're working with him. I almost never use it anymore. I still have a little bit left over from when I bought it by the truckload when I was staying with him. But it smells to high heaven and it's really toxic. But mostly I don't like the way it's like liquid. It tacks up really fast. And I'm not a very fast painter. So I don't want it to have that kind of molasses feeling. I want oil paint to feel like oil. I want it to be slippery. And so that stickiness bothers me. A lot of the time I will mix just the old standard medium of, what is it? Part oil, part solvent, like mineral spirits, and part, they used to use copaluminium.
DeMar varnish.
Or DeMar varnish, yeah. Both of those are resins. So when I make it, I use a modern resin. I use walnut oil instead of the linseed oil. I use mineral spirits for the solvent, and for the resin I use Galkid, which is an alkyd resin, because it doesn't change colors. And I can control how fast it dries by how much oil I put in it. More oil, it dries slower. More galket, it dries faster. And you can make it as watery as you want it to be or as thick as you want it to be by how much solvent you put in it. I also use another medium that I call walnut gel that I make myself. Both of the mediums that I use regularly, I make myself. And the walnut gel is simply liquid impasto. Winsor Newton makes this liquid, and they make one called liquid impasto that comes in a tube like toothpaste, and it's a really thick gel kind of medium. But it's way too thick for my taste, and it's stiff. And so I squirt out a bunch of that on my palette, and I drip walnut oil into it, and I mix it up with a palette knife, and I just keep putting oil into it until it feels light and fluffy. But I stop before it turns into liquid. And then I load it in a tube, in an empty paint tube, and use that.